Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Learning in a Sharing Economy, Disrupt or Die. This is a series of webinars where we connect for 30 minutes to bring to life some of the challenges that we see in the marketplace and what we can possibly do about them. Today, Pamela Mattsson, Managing Partner of North America, will be digging into how the classic L&D world was designed around knowledge and expertise. But actually, the world has evolved, and it's time we do as well. For the webinar today, there is some space for questions that we reserved at the end. So if you have any questions, you can use the control panel to type anything that might come up during the presentation. And with that, I hand it off to you, Pamela.
Thank you, Barbie. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Learning in the Sharing Economy, Disrupt or Die. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you a bit about our VUCA world and the disruption in the learning and development industry, our learning and development world, including the connection to our sharing economy and the impact on the business. So let's be real. Our classic L&D world was designed around knowledge and expertise, and sometimes the haves and the have-nots, and the world's evolved, and it's time, like Barbie said, that we do as well. We don't necessarily need more content or more cognitive knowledge. It's all at our fingertips. And if you look at the different eras on this slide of things that have influenced both our economy and our social systems, like the agricultural age, the industrial age, the information age of knowledge workers, we're now entering an era that is changing exponentially. It's an era that has more change, stress, and complexity than any of these other eras combined. And they're being led by creators. And the hallmark of creators, so these are our leaders, the learners that we're serving, are focused on humility, curiosity. These are the types of things: creativity, agility, and collaboration. And like I said, the rate of change is changing so quickly. How we serve these leaders and create a context in this VUCA world requires a different way of designing a leadership and development strategy. So let's talk about disruption for a moment. So like I said earlier, content, cognitive knowledge is one Bing, one Google, one MOOC, one TEDTalk away. We live in a world of savvy, digitally native knowledge workers where very little happens, even if you're an individual contributor, without the interdependency of others and the influence on outside data. Gone are the days of simply rolling out a training. We've entered this digital disruption where it can be both a tool, it can be a distraction, and it makes the need to keep the human and the interpersonal touch in all of our interactions, especially our learning and development interactions. This means that disruptions become one more thing for us to navigate, and potential opportunities like the flipped classroom, virtual conferences, what we now know and often misinterpret about the neuroscience of learning and the neuroscience of navigating change. Disruption in our industry is being influenced by social learning, by media, social media, this ability to even bring your own device and think about corporate restructuring that's often leaving us taking care of what we would call survivors and then setting them up to be the future leaders of the organization. We also have disruption of what we would call the sharing economy. There are huge implications to learning and development as a result of the sharing economy. We all know that the number and the degree to which our organizations are also dependent on global, not only global, but also virtual teams, and often virtual as a result of being global. Most of our work is done in this. It requires stellar collaboration if you're working in a virtual setting, especially when you think about the desire that these teams, these global virtual teams, are not only high performance, but purpose-driven, because many of these teams are not able to source their success by a task, because the task can change in a single email. The charge of a team could change. So teams are now forced not only to work globally and virtually, but to source their sense of success and efficacy intrinsically. That's why I'm pointing to the purpose-driven. With these, the training and development needs and the implications around that are huge. In fact, the research is showing that not only is the management and leadership skills to effectively manage a high-performance virtual and global team, not only are they different from even co-located teams or certainly a single location teams, but sometimes even quite the opposite. For global and virtual teams, we need to lead differently, make decisions differently, build trust differently, and communicate differently. So let me just dive into that a little bit more, because it does have implications in our disrupted L&D organizations. So co-located teams can benefit from a leader that acts more of a facilitator, but when you're working with a global and a virtual team, it requires a skill set that unhinges some of the VUCA that I'm going to be talking about later, and creating very clear expectations. Sometimes in a co-located team, the roles and responsibilities can be shared and a little bit more loose, but in a global virtual team, it's essential that the clarity of role, clarity of expectations, how one would be successful in the team is critical, and it needs to be clear. We have to formalize those roles and responsibilities. Making decisions in a very, very different way. It's being culturally sensitive, but knowing that I think that the self-awareness piece for a leader is huge here in working with a virtual team, that your way of thinking, say for example, making decisions with a strong drive where the leader's driving versus, as one would do in North America, versus a strong and healthy debate that would be typical of South America, or leader-driven in Asia. So the different ways that we're doing things. Think about Scandinavia, long conversations that build consensus. And again, it's not about knowing what to do in all of those environments, but being aware as a leader and training up these skills. Again, these are the skills necessary for leading virtual and global teams, to be able to be self-aware that your decision-making style may not meet the needs of some of the members of the team, and the self-awareness and the communication skills necessary to set alignment around that. Also, the research supports that building trust in a virtual team is all about reliability, that trust is being built by response time, by people executing on what they say they will execute on, when they say they will do it. So this impeccable coordination is needed, which of course impacts communication, the frequency of communication, and the ability of a leader to be compelling and engaging and inspiring, even in a virtual setting. So these implications mean for us that in addition to the digital disruption, these human elements in a virtual world, the way we build trust, impeccable coordination, and the reliability required to build trust is a very different ask of our L&D departments and requires a very different strategy. This slide is intentionally busy, intentionally perhaps even overwhelming. So adding again to the L&D disruption of our industry, think about big data. Think about all the areas where we gather information. I mean, collectively, we're creating huge amounts of data as we travel the interweb every day. On one end of the spectrum, organizations are increasingly in a position, whether they realize it or not, to mine that data and find out more about what's popular, what's coming next, the trends, what's right around the corner, and perhaps most importantly, what's actually having impact in their industry and the products and services they deliver. But we don't always see this incorporated in the L&D strategy. You know, how do we utilize the big data? And I think this is one of the nice paradoxical points, that it's not just the analytics of big data that has the true impact on an organization, but it's the leaders who can both analyze and then utilize skills of collaboration and influence. Because when you're harvesting data from all of these sources, some of the insights can be surprising and could, you know, be met with resistance. So it's not just the analytical skills, but the skills of collaboration, the skills of influencing and utilizing that data, especially in organizations where experience, especially past experience and institutional wisdom, rule the world. So leaders that can not only learn the skill sets of analytics, but also be able to influence, meet resistance, and create buy-in are critical in leveraging big data. I've referenced this in several of our webinars because I think it's a valid piece of information to keep in mind, that we do live in a VUCA world. You know, it is volatile, it is uncertain, there is complexity, there is ambiguity. So again, the leadership skills that are necessary in a VUCA environment are very different from ones that were about simply leadership, command control, hierarchy, executing on decisions. It's almost as if part of our role as learning and development professionals is to enable learning to happen at all times, at any time, in many, many different ways. And it's the ability to pivot in a decision and respond to what's happening in the world. So with this increased complexity, we've got this importance of our bench strength. You know, part of the complexity that we have in our workforce is a multi-generational workforce. The pervasive tone of teamwork, the importance of working as teams, and again, not only high-performance teams, but purpose-driven teams, so that it's not the task that measures success, but the process and the way in which we work together that measures success. It's work-life integration. It's about performance management and measuring not only ticks a box of training and development that happens across the organization, but what's the actual real impact on the business. So it's having us look in a very, very different way and look at antidotes to VUCA. And you'll see here on this slide that, you know, we're referencing many of the content areas that is required to be working in a VUCA environment, to be creating workplaces where learning is a way of life. It's the way we go about doing our work. So if we look at this as we move, you know, from a world of problems which demand speed and analysis and the elimination of uncertainty to solve, we're really moving into a world of dilemmas. And this demands patience and sense-making, and the engagement, the welcoming of uncertainty. If we look at the antidote to VUCA, a lot of our learning and development strategy and ways of working in the organization are focused on creating leaders that can provide vision, you know, a real intent that seeks to create a future, understanding, the ability to help people make sense of what's happening, to stop, to look, to listen, to provide clarity, not clarity in terms of a lack of uncertainty, but clarity in making sense of the chaos and responding quickly and with agility to the chaos that exists in our organizations today. And I would say that this is a pointing to that some of the aspects of what we're building in our organizations through learning and development and creating learning cultures is this ability to let go of what previous success looked like. Not only the way we did things in the past, but even the way we define our identity as leaders, and put in that definition, this new definition, that my ability to learn, my ability to engage with uncertainty, my ability to create buy-in and leverage the diversity of opinions and ideas around the table, my ability to co-create across the organization with teams, is the real definition of success in the 21st century. And that's what we're trying to enable in the work that we do. So this engagement with contradictions and paradoxes, and the ability to manage tensions and not simply apply problem-solving mentality or ways of working when there's a tension or a polarity to be managed. We're definitely moving from the world of this or that, either or, to a world of both and much more complex leadership skills needed that can't simply come from programs that are developed at the top and then cascaded and rolled down to the organization. Not only is this not cost effective, it doesn't meet the current mindset and needs of a VUCA world. So I want to point a bit to open source. And I'd say this open source learning, it's a reference from the way a lot of modern software has been developed. If we open that up and talk about what it means to be building literally on the ideas of others. But if we think about learning today requires a blend of different leadership qualities, and I've been referencing some of them, this adaptive and strategic thinking, yes, of course, business acumen, but the ability to lead innovation with creativity, a solid embodied knowledge of change management. Like I said earlier, the ability to leverage diversity and sustainability and tapping into a socially responsible mindset, creating commitment, trust, building partnerships. Leaders need humility, learning attitude, vision, functional expertise. So the list goes on, and you can imagine the ability to open up an organization's learning management system, the ability to tap into things like TEDTalks, MOOCs. This is a way that we set up our organization to have peer-to-peer learning, peer-to-peer coaching, and information that's shared throughout the organization and available to everyone across the bands versus closed to executive or closed to managers of managers or closed to individual contributors. This is a way to leverage what's in the organization. It's leveraging that sharing economy and the open source mindset. It means that we're most engaged with our learning. We know this. It's in our DNA when it's internally driven, personally meaningful, and purposefully guided. So I know for me, myself, when I'm researching something or I'm on the internet or watching a TED Talk and it's something that I've opted in, then I'm much more interested in that information. So the more we make open source learning available to our organizations, the better. And the challenge is not just simply in integrating new technology into our system. It's not about the technology or the digital enablement, although that's an important part of it. It's not the platform, it's really the mindset. So it's about, in order to encourage customization and innovation and empower leaders to embrace and engage with the learning process, the culture they're preparing to influence, we need to really shift a lot of the fundamental assumptions about learning and the way learning is engaged in within an organization, especially across band levels, and really open up the learning, the information, the IP, and leverage it across the system. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story about open source. And you may have seen this in the news. It was covered by CBS quite a lot. But the University of Washington biochemistry department was working on the protein that's needed for the HIV medication. So they were working on an antidote to HIV, and proteins are very, very complex. So this group of researchers have been working with this for about a decade and were stymied. They were really struggling because there's so many different ways that a string of protein can unfold and connect. And so they partnered with the computer science department of the university and created a game. And they gamified this protein, the way it unfolds. They did it true to the science, and within a 10-day period, so again, they've been working on this for a decade, within a 10-day period, gamers were able to solve the protein solution. So I'm pointing to this because this is a way that demonstrates the open source, and it's outside of the L&D industry, but you can imagine what this means. The implications, as I hear it, is, wow, what's possible when we seek support, ideas, collaboration, information outside of the mindset in which we work. So marketing leaning into finance leaning into R&D. What happens when we cross-pollinate and create a culture, a learning culture, where we are constantly challenging people to have diversity on their teams, and not just the classic diversity, but pulling from different aspects of the organization and really working as one organization and across the organization effectively. Related to the sharing economy and our app world is the idea of opting in and opting out. And I think this is an important part of learning too, is that we live in this VUCA world, and what we see emerging is the necessity for organizations to disrupt the way that they're creating development opportunities. Again, we can't just roll out the training. We have to Uberize it, if you will, that we have to understand, what is truly being needed, what's truly wanted in an organization, what learning is going to support what we need in terms of the future leadership competencies and capabilities of our leaders, and how do we create expert disruptors, transformative environments where learning and development are easy, seamless, and collaborative, and as easy to opt in and opt out of as it would be to call an Uber or to engage with Airbnb or any of the other great sharing economy inventions that are coming around. How do we create that? This is referencing the virtual classroom, and I want to speak to that a bit too, because this always brings, for me at least, a conversation around digital capability and the platform, and that's not a small thing. That's an important thing to have the digital platform. But I want to speak to one of the things I think we forget when we start focusing on the digital enablement of the virtual classroom is this human element. And for us to remember as learning and development professionals that connection, that humanizing it, that creating not only engagement in a virtual setting, but relevance in a virtual setting. How do we keep that human element and blend in the opportunities for learning and action as people go about their day-to-day rhythm of business and their day-to-day jobs? Peer-to-peer, high five, look at that. So the peer-to-peer learning, I think, is also a huge thing that we're tapping into as we look at the disruption in the L&D industry, the importance of opening up these dialogues. And like I referenced earlier, creating the safety and the humanness in the environment where we can put our ego in check and hold that learning and development is a critical part of the way we demonstrate success, that we open up that gap. And one of the ways that we can do that is to create opportunities for people to be learning together, for people to be discussing real challenges together, and not setting up that to be a check-in or a task mastering where we're just demonstrating or proving what we know, but that we're really saying, okay, learning and development is a sign of success, and Not only am I more effective, but I build strong networks and connections across the organization when I lean into my peers for their expertise and their knowledge. And the further outside of my work area, the better. Better for the organization, better for us in meeting the needs of our customers, and better for us working seamlessly together across the organization. So what do you do? A little call to action for you. So I love this question. What would Uber do? So think about your learning and development strategy, your plan. How would you disrupt yourself? How do you actively disrupt? How do you take inventory and assessment of what's really working, what's really relevant within the organization? And one place to look is, what are the workarounds? And let me say what I mean by that. What do you see happening in the organization as it relates to learning and development that people are doing as sort of a patchwork? What's the doorstop to hold the door open? How can we innovate ways of learning? If people are going out to TED Talks and leaning on the internet for information, how do we build that in to be a natural part? What apps are already being used on leaders' devices, and how do we bring that in to the learning and development conversations? I had the pleasure of watching the Chief Learning Officer of Disney speak recently, and Disney is this animation, amazing organization. So I just expected to hear about all of the seamless, beautiful video content and learning and development that they were using, and it was refreshing to hear her talk about, actually learning can happen anywhere at any time and from anyone. So we're less interested in the slick presentation, which slows down learning, and much more interested in making it available. So what's available on their internet or intranet is, pretty basic videos of people across the organization. Anyone can create a teaching video. There are small cameras, flippets available everywhere. It can be just simply filmed on your mobile phone or your mobile device, and then it gets loaded up. It doesn't have to be perfect or slick or edited, but if you've got something to offer in the sharing economy of learning at Disney, you can absolutely do that, and they enable that. So looking at how we leverage disruption and innovation in our sharing economy, look at what are the workarounds in your organization and what's actually being utilized and impactful. So again, as a final word, our invitation is creativity is inventing, experimenting, growing, taking risks, breaking rules, making mistakes, and having fun. Quote from Mary Lou Cook. So my invitation to you as a learning and development professional is, look at how you can actively and productively, and even, dare I say, lovingly disrupt and respond to the mindsets and behaviors that are being shaped in us in a socioeconomic way through the sharing economy, and leverage that for creating a solid learning environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. So I want to open up the questions to everyone. So if you have a question, you can type it into your control panel in the questions section. And the first question we have is, what can I do to get my senior leaders to engage in this?
Great. Well, I think that a very simple answer to that question is opening the dialogue. I think that if we look at what actually is happening out in the world, and I'm sure it happens for them, simply opening the dialogue with what's on your device right now, what's on your mobile device, what apps do you use, what apps do you not use, where do you source your learning? And for some people, it can be as simple and classic as the paper that they read in the morning, to the TED Talks that they watch, on an airplane, magazines that they read, even if they're online. But to open the dialogue of, how do we, as human beings in this digitally enabled society, really, really source our learning? And then how well do we share that learning? And what are some of the assumptions, mindsets, even rules of our learning and development strategy that are just begging to be challenged, so that we can leverage what's actually happening out in society and create that same environment within our system and our organization in service of our strategy, and in service of connecting the human beings that are the heartbeat of our organization and our success.
Great. Thank you, Pamela. The next question is, what skills can we teach our people to get them always prepared for disruption?
Great question. So I would say that the first place that sends me is the conversation around identity. And I mentioned it a couple of times throughout the webinar, but it's not a small conversation of how we hold ourselves and our self-identity or self-esteem around learning what it means to be discovered, to not know something. So we're required in this day and age as learning and development professionals to create the mindsets of learners. You can look to some of the data and research around growth versus a fixed mindset, or in our content, knower versus learner. But the crux of that is I source my self-esteem from knowing, being right, and exercising, in with great intentions, my expertise on something. Nothing wrong with that, but the better able we are as leaders and to create learning environments where even experts are expressing their expertise with a level of humility that opens up ideas from anywhere, that we're able to leverage the diversity of thought in and across our teams and across our organizations, the better. So I would say that one of the key skills is really, letting go of that ego, being willing to be influenced, being excited about someone disagreeing with you because they see it differently. They might be seeing something that you don't see. So building in big pointing is the mindsets, and then on top of the mindsets would be, if you hold that the currency of culture is the way we communicate, and that organizations are networks of communication and agreements or commitments, the way in which our semantics and the way we frame things, the way we communicate, negotiate, coordinate across the organization is very reflective of the mindsets that we hold. So to look there, that the building on the mindsets of a learner mindset, that agility, where there's less dependence for a leader's ego, nothing wrong with an ego, but less dependent of a leader's ego on certainty, on being right, on knowing, on proving, and moving much more toward this. I source my success and my self-esteem from learning, from having insights with others, learning through others, and that there's agility in action and learning can happen at any time, and definitely while I'm in the work and on the job.
Thank you, Pamela. We have another question. What are common obstacles to developing a sharing economy at work?
I think they're natural and they're human. And I remember a colleague in Asia giving a talk about purpose-driven teams, and he was sharing some information about the sharing economy and open source content and IP, and painted a picture of what it would be like to, just put everything on the table, all of the IP, collaborate. And he said it was like a river had parted and half the room was saying, wow, what a relief. How much energy and time do we spend protecting our ideas and thinking that, if we're putting all our cards on the table, that we might lose something or something might be at risk. And then the other half of the room saying, what are you talking about? No way would I do that. That's our leverage. That's how we make our money. So there's a way that this sharing economy is influencing the way we make decisions, the way we see the world, the way we see learning and development, and it requires a very different mindset to open that up. So I would say looking at, where are we reinforcing competition internally? And sometimes that can be productive in an innovative setting, and sometimes it can be counterproductive. How are we creating the forums for people to share information? Who gets stage time? Who doesn't get stage time? How much are we putting learning into our day-to-day agendas? How are meetings run? Are we focused on that? Is there, is it easy? Is it user friendly and easy to do? So creating that sharing economy, look to the outside, look for the mindsets of information hoarding versus information sharing. Look to the mindsets of how we can leverage resources together, shared resources internally, and then of course the sharing of IP, ideas, information across the system.
Thank you, Pamela. We have another question. What is the first thing we can do to start getting our organizations thinking this way?
That's great. Well, I think it's similar to the question around opening the dialogue with senior leaders is to look to their own lives, like look to your own life and open up a dialogue around that of, where do you opt in? Where do you opt out? What apps are on your phone? What apps are not on your phone? What has you delete things? What has you use things? Where are there workarounds in the organization that this could be a huge and effective solution to? But I think often this conversation gets started with, what's the problem we're here to solve, and how can we leverage what's actually happening in the organization and what we're trying to force versus what has flow. And one example would be if we look at the efficacy of global virtual programs. One of the programs that we did recently, we were building in an inclusive leadership component, and we can get very complex with unconscious bias and micro inequities, and all of that content's fabulous. But when we really looked at the issue, what came about was a simple and very profound conversation about what was required behaviorally for people to feel welcomed, heard, respected, and valued. So you can imagine the global virtual teams, small things like recognizing people that came onto the call or spending a few minutes talking about a personal success. So these types of things that make a huge difference, but to look to the organization and say, what's the problem we're here to solve? How can we leverage what we know as human beings, what we do in the other part of our life, even though that's a fallacy of separation of personal and professional. But what actually do we opt in? What do we opt out of? How can we leverage this real conversation about what's relevant and what's effective, and challenge the way we measure, challenge this idea that we design and develop content. It comes from the top. We're the experts. We're the sage on the stage instead of being the guide on the side. How can we enable learning rather than being the experts of learning?
Great, thank you. And the last question we have is, why do you think the sharing economy is so successful?
Such a great question. Well, for me, because it works. I think that it because it works. It solves a problem and solves a source of frustration that perhaps we had. And I think it also taps into our shared humanity. There's something that for me at least feels good, feels right about, I have a need, and you supporting me with that need also supports you. So I think we're tapping into not only shared economy, but shared humanity, and that's powerful. It also is a huge, conversation about trust, how we build trust and connection, and where digital enablement can be quite divisive. If we're all looking down at our phone, but it also can be quite connecting. And you hear stories. I know I've had this experience too. If you're doing an Airbnb and you're renting a room and the people are there, I have a colleague that recently went skiing with his family in Japan and talked about just the Airbnb. How excited they were to have a Western family come into their home, and they made a meal free of charge, the delight that the host took in putting chocolates on their pillows and providing robes. And so all of this done with care becomes like hugely disruptive and competitive to companies that have done this on huge and large scales. Just think about the hotel or hospitality industry and have lost touch with the user experience. So I think it's working because it's about shared humanity. I think it's working because you solving my need also helps you, and because this naturally and organically focuses on value creation and the user experience, because it's built into apps like Uber that if you don't get a certain ranking, you're out. You need to explain it. So the economy of sharing speaks for itself, and there's no feeling of being taken advantage of.
Great, thank you. And we have another question that came in. Do you find that younger people are more receptive to these ideas?
You know, I would say yes, but I'm not sure that if the research would support that, because I think that there are exceptions across the world where, you know, there's grandparents and baby boomers and people using apps and probably even a more savvy way than even our younger millennials. I think it's a natural part of a digital native to be app oriented, sharing oriented, and innovative, but I don't think that it doesn't cross the bands of generations. I think that it might require, like I said earlier, a shift in mindset, and I hold that to be about trust. I think it's interesting. There's a great movie called The Intern, and it's kind of silly, kind of a movie, but it's Robert De Niro and Anne Hathaway, and Robert De Niro becomes the intern of Anne Hathaway, and it's hilarious to watch, you know, someone from an older generation get involved in something that's simulating something like Zappos. So she has a company that looks like Zappos. But the reliability of the use of the app, the use of technology, the ease, that user experience, like I said earlier, creates that trust and brings people back.
Great, thank you, Pamela. Those were the questions. So thank you everyone for joining us today. And a quick reminder that the next webinar will be on March 25th, and the topic will be Good People Do Bad Things. So make sure to be on the lookout for an email from us and join us. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.